Yeah, how do you, what do you think about food scraps in composting and moldering toilets? Do you prohibit them, or do you encourage them to maybe boost compost temperatures?
We wondered about that for a few years with our compost toilets, and we were hauling off all this food scrap that we used to keep in 30-gallon trash cans in a black garbage sack in the hut so the bears wouldn't get it. So you know how nasty that can be in the summer. So we developed these bear boxes which stand right beside the compost toilet. So the food scraps go into the bear box with wood chips, and we've had clients watch bears knock them around. They don't get into them. And then the food scraps go right into the composter, and that human waste smell in the composter that we don't pick up with our nose, the animals know that that's taboo, and they don't mess with our compost toilets at all with a tremendous amount of food scrap, like tuna fish, bacon, cheese, you name it, stuff that bears love, and it works.
When I was teaching some classes on septics and systems, one of the graphics we had was a picture of a toilet lid up with a sign on it that says, "Don't put anything in here you haven't eaten first." And the reason is that in septic systems, which is biologically based just like a composting toilet, if it hadn't been through the human body and made that first breakdown of nutrients, then food scraps take a lot longer to break down. So, and I would imagine it'd be the same thing in composting toilets. So that it takes a lot longer to break down. And the process, like in septic systems where you have, what do you call them, food grinders in the sink, you know, they're not really good for septic systems either. So the same thing goes to,
We've dealt pretty extensively with food waste management, and initially we had visitors deposit their food waste into the outhouses, and we would compost it, but a couple things occurred over time. One was rodents actually were more attracted to it, so we had mice inside the collector, which you get some anyway because they go for the toilet paper to nest. And many of these locations have three-sided lean-tos or shelters, and the mice tend to go into them too. So we had mice and feces going where people were sleeping. So we wanted to sever that. And one of the ways we did it was just turn the ethic around. If people weren't at a designated campsite, they wouldn't be leaving their food waste behind, hopefully. So we now have everybody pack out their food waste, and we are not composting it.
If you can ensure that you have thermophilic composting, which is going to be basically 122 degrees Fahrenheit or 50 degrees centigrade or above, you can compost food waste, you can compost animal carcasses, you can compost just about anything. But it has to be, you have to make sure that you're getting that. One of the ways to do that is to have a designated compost pile in which the toilet material is placed into, never onto, but into. And that pile is usually going to be mainly constructed out of a carbonaceous, bulky material like straw, or we're using sugarcane bagasse in Haiti, for instance. And then you get an insulating factor, and you get the temperatures building up. But it is absolutely critical that those temperatures go up, or if not, what the composters have been saying for years, which is no meats, fats, oils, they're right. If you're in the mesophilic range, they're right. If you get to the thermophilic range, it's a new game. So I'm a big fan of getting the temperatures up when it's possible.
Yeah, I'm curious in the situations where you have people pee in the woods and not use the composting toilets, do you end up with lots of Charmin flowers behind trees? I mean, how do you manage that situation? Because I've been in areas where that's a real issue.
You get some of that. We go back to these blue bags. So we ask visitors, females, to use that little bit of TP if they need to, or use an actual product and dispose of it in the bag. We found that it's, and this is just one of those as managers, there's certain things you accept. Dealing with a little bit of TP that we find maybe that visitors have left behind just from urinating, we can pick that up and deal with it and put it in the composter. For us, that's more preferred than excessive urine in the composter. I think one of the ways the Northeast systems differ than the Western systems is that the air is just so humid in the Northeast, and we have a lot of rainfall, and the winters are cold and snow. So we don't have the hot, dry conditions ambient. So liquid continues to be a challenge. So even having this little bit of trash issue to deal means that the urine didn't go in, and that's helpful for us.
You've touched a little bit on some of the differences in the Northeast versus the Southwest, but what would be some other key considerations for arid western conditions in composting in river canyons, low-level deserts sort of situations?
I'll just make one comment, and I'll let some of the other folks answer that. When we're talking about the external conditions to a compost pile, the humidity level of the air and the ambient temperature, these are factors that contribute to what's going to happen internal in the pile, but they're not as much of a contributor as actually what's going on the inside. So having higher and drier, or hotter and drier ambient is going to be favorable for a compost pile. And you have to maybe then think more about the moisture management of actually having to adding. So it gets to that inverse of the equation.
In talking with the Texas Park Service, when they first thought our evaporative toilet was a composter, they said it won't work in West Texas because it's too dry. And that apparently they have had considerable trouble with the composter drying out and dying from lack of moisture, because it just added to the maintenance. And when they finally figured out this was not primarily a composter, then they thought, oh, it worked great. And and sure enough, it is doing a good job. So there is a critical thing. You know, like I said, everything has its limitations. Our unit works best as the hotter it is. A composter works better where I think the humidity is higher. Well, I had a guy call me about a rainforest in Mexico that he wanted to put them in. I thought, well, I don't think that's going to work down there. You know, you already have 100%, I mean, not a rainforest, a cloud forest, where this mountaintop village was always in the cloud. So with 100% humidity, you're not going to get much evaporation. So our unit wouldn't work.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common for all these different systems that we keep hearing about, is that they do take a regular maintenance person of some type to some degree or other who understands the system, the peculiarities of each system, one different from the other. And that amount of maintenance will be defined by that climate and the number of usages that are visiting that site.
Every unit and every situation is site specific. The conditions, I mean, they can vary within a few miles.
The theme of maintenance is key today, and we all know that's true, and you guys really spoke that loud and clear today. The thing I have is, and then at the end, you were saying how it's great to talk a lot of poo and get excited about it. Now, I'm wondering, and you know, with the Appalachian Trail and all that, what is some of the insights, and I did ask Joe this question, of finding people that can stick around with the maintenance, if there's some filters or if there's some key things and insight as a manager to say, this person's gonna stay around and be able to stir that pot or handle the poo. And I just want to know if you have any insights of who you can hire, or if they're gonna stick with it and learn and be diligent on dealing with it over time.
Yeah, that's a great point. And in our business, we have a bit of turnover in personnel, but we've got folks that have been with us for like 9 years as well. And whenever a new hire comes in, it always gets down to, okay, when do I pop the question of like the compost toilet and the duty involved there? And you kind of feel a person out a little bit about, you think they can handle this or not? And your gut level reaction is probably the correct one. But like Hawk was saying, after you start working this, even the person who's like, everyone's a little bit hesitant at first, but if you think you've got a right potential person and they get out there and do it a few times, it's amazing how they can turn around and go, this isn't so bad, and it's pretty cool. You know, they kind of get it. And that's the kind of person you're looking for. And there's more of them out there than you think. And I thought it was going to be really a scary deal when I started doing this, but it's not the ugly monster that most people think it will be until they've had actual contact with the whole activity.
It's exactly right. There's a perception that builds up, a stigma attached to it, and as we pointed out, you make it as favorable as you can. I mean, you're dealing with a undesirable medium to begin with, but there's things you can do to make it more conducive to people wanting to do it. The other thing we do is whether it's our backcountry rangers or caretakers or whatever, it's one of their responsibilities. It's not the only thing they do. So they do visitor education, they do trail work, they do campsite maintenance. So it's just part of their job description, one aspect of it. But it tends to be the one that, as I pointed out, they actually take some pride in because of how effective it is. As far as the initial selection, it's a fairly competitive process for these positions, working in the backcountry. So it's important up front that people realize that's part of the job, because it can be a filter for the ones who just want to be out there. But usually the ones that really want to do it, they care. They're stewards. They want to take care of the landscape, the environment, and serve the people. So
I just heard earlier that it doesn't always work, like, for example, when there's 100% humidity. So just another climatic question on climatic conditions. What would you do in a cold, arid place? How would you make composting or moldering work in those sort of conditions?
I mean, there are some designers who've insulated the bins or the container, whatever you're actually putting it in, so that what heat is generated in the pile is not only insulated by the pile but also externally. You work with your season as best you can. I mean, in the White Mountains, granted the mountains only are 5,000 and 6,000 feet, but you see minus 20 degrees for sometimes 20 days continuous and well below zero. So the pile goes into a state of dormancy in the winter months, and you reinvigorate, say, come June. So we have really effective composting from June till like mid-October. You'd have to look at your specific environment, but if there's a window in there where you can do the bulk of your work and take advantage of the ambient and try and move stuff through at that time period.
If you remember the one at Rocky Mountain National Park, we had a hot air panel that it can be passive, but we actually pull it through with a photovoltaic fan. But we can get as much as 195 degrees out of those things. We're real high, a lot of ultraviolet, and I imagine you're pretty high as well. So you can use that to amplify that general pile temperature. And the biggest thing, when we studied back in 1983 with the Public Health Service, they sent me to Hawaii, and they said, find out why the one at Haleakala worked so well and the one at Voyageurs National Park didn't. And got within a day at Haleakala, I knew why they went so well. All season long, it was 76 degrees and 65% humidity. It's perfect. The one at Voyageurs, perfect in the summer, totally crash in the winter. So one of the solutions was to put hot air panels on there to extend that season so that the pile didn't crash during the winter.
Yeah, you can borrow some ideas from gardeners who extend their growing season, through solar, through insulation, through various covering of end product, to make sure. So tweak it, get as long as you can out of it.
We tried creating biogas at 3,800 meters together with a Swiss aid company, organization rather, and it didn't work. Nobody could figure out at the time why. That was about 10 years ago. So I still have this big chamber. It's now used for rainwater harvesting. But if any of you are ever in the Everest region, it's a village called Kumjung near Namche Bazaar. So please do get in touch with me. If you can figure out why it's not working, I'll let you tweak around with it to make it work.
So on a practical matter, what sorts of toilet paper work the best, brands or types, and how about additives? Can you talk about additives?
As for, in the world of ecological sanitation, of which I believe composting certainly has part, though I have not seen that much written about it, there's a lot of talk about adding soil or ash or other things to sort of kill the pathogens. And one of the things, Joe Jenkins is a colleague of mine that I'm working with in Haiti. We've talked about this a lot, and that is that things that tend to kill things tend to not promote composting. And it's sort of obvious when you think about it, but ash and some of these other things it's an attempt to kill stuff off, and you'll actually really mess up your process. So I don't know on the toilet paper part, but certainly in terms of adding things like ash and soil, it's best to add things that are going to promote thermophilic composting to get those temperatures up, and then you don't have to worry about killing stuff off.
The best thing to add is naturally occurring microbes that are in the surrounding environment. So that's where the bulking agent can do that. And through the mystery of nature, they sort of find their way in, even in sealed containers, or almost sealed. On toilet paper, it's the first thing to go in a composter. We prefer people don't use the colored stuff because maybe it's got dyes and stuff that take longer, but white toilet paper in just a couple days after doing that homogenizing or mixing, it starts to break down, and by the time the product's done, there's no trace of it. Give you a sense of the effectiveness. We find clothing items often inside these systems, and like cotton boxers, all the cotton's completely decomposed. The only thing that's left is the elastic band. Everything's gone. T-shirts, we don't encourage that, but it shows the effectiveness of that heat, is it'll break that down too.
In his presentation, there was a composing equipment facilities. That is a commercial basis. So most important is, number one is the temperature, 40 degrees centigrade. So that's composing facility can adjust to 40 to 60, but the ideal temperature is 40 degrees centigrade. And the second point is bacillus, microbiome. Microbiome has to be sealed. Sealed in the container. This is important. And the number three is the moisture content should be 60%. That is the ideal. And number four, you need a carbon source. So they're using kind of the grain shell. The grain, we say soba. I don't know if you know or not. The soba noodle. So there's a shell. So shell is a carbon source. So carbon source is required. Sometimes you can put a vegetable oil. Waste, used vegetable oil, you can put it as a carbon source. Maybe toilet paper, you can put it as a carbon source in the system. And this system is running 5 years. There's no waste for dumping. So they're adding soba shell. So no waste for dumping. This point he made it. We have a panel, information over there. So if you have some questions, please come up.
So it seems like, stepping back to the fundamental objective, the point of composting toilets is to reduce environmental impact, especially looking sort of globally in terms of the whole life cycle analysis, but also locally at your site of interest. And it seems like one of the distinguishing characteristics of is a composting toilet right from the decision-making point of view is if you can dispose on site. If you can't, probably doesn't make sense to choose a composting toilet. So now that if you can dispose of it on site, how do you know, each of you in your sites or when you're planning, how do you know whether the impact of disposal is actually better than what you're doing before?
I suppose indicators of whether it's preferred or not would be things like not burying waste, pit toilet and leach out into water. That's a consideration. Your overall investment financially, so back to that airlift again, or whatever means to get material out, and infrastructure that you have to build to do it. That's another indicator of whether, like on that if-then sort of decision, which way you go in that flow chart. And then, is there a greater environmental benefit? It probably depends on what kind of resources you have to put in the front end. If there's a lot of fuel involved, or then it may not make sense in the bigger scheme of things. But I think for on-site treatment, is the water protected? Is the outhouse going to be used by people? Is it appealing versus problems when people don't use them because they get dirty or smell? And what's the messaging you're giving the public about waste management? Those are the things we consider.
in a case like the one in Peru where I work, the only thing that was going to happen is on-site disposal. So we were just looking for a system that would keep it out of the watershed and, if possible, reuse the resource. You know, in those resource scarce areas, it's a potentially valuable material. So it seemed like a no-brainer in that case, as long as you can protect people and livestock and such from exposure.
I have two modes of, 2 points of view here. One from the human waste management perspective and another from farming. And one of the popular things that's going on in Texas, and I think largely with the green movement, is to have alternate forms of fertilization for agriculture. Two things. One, and y'all probably know more about this than I do, but I understand there's like they call a Vietnamese version of composting where you have a very definite drainage of the urine separate, because you can take the urine and dilute it, and you got urea fertilizer, natural urea, best fertilizer you could possibly get. And it's not made from bomb residuals, you know. The other thing is that you take good compost that's been properly finished, and you boil it in an aerated chamber of water to let the little microbes multiply vigorously. Then you spray that on a hayfield or your crops, and you have another good fertilizer. So it is Mother Nature's normal biological cycle.
Essentially, composting is accelerating the process of what would end up in the environment anyway. If you think about human beings on the earth and depositing their waste for the millions of years that they have, if you know that eventually can be absorbed by the system. Our challenge is in concentrated areas. We have this high amount which can't be absorbed, you know, readily. So we create a system that accelerates that, and then we can essentially introduce something in the environment similar to would be there in lower levels.
By saying there is a huge demand for fertilizer in, not necessarily in climbing environments, this is more in a development context, but where we are working in Port-au-Prince, we are composting using sugarcane bagasse and sawdust, and there's a demand for that compost to get right back into local agriculture. So it's a part of awareness raising on the part of farmers, and then they will demand it because it's very good. It's very high quality compost.
To answer your question, I think you touched on the overall impact of dealing with the waste on site. And for us, it was a bonus in a number of ways. It absolutely saved us money in terms of fossil fuels, hauling the stuff all over the place, food and human waste, and the fossil fuels made in the manufacture of black trash bags, et cetera. So let's say you had a few pathogens escaping into the environment that were in the corner of the compost bin that didn't get folded in, although we were aware of that, and we do that folded into the center of the heap, versus all the other infrastructure that's involved in, you know, drilling for oil, et cetera, and driving a vehicle out there to pick it up and driving it back and then taking it to a sewage treatment plant and all that business, versus just dealing with it on site. And to me, it's very clear and simple which way I prefer in terms of lessening my footprint impact on the planet with what I'm doing out there with my huts.